Okay, no. Um, okay, so there was something weird going on. I think there's a bug on YouTube. Um, yeah, there's a bug on YouTube. Okay, so I'm now streaming on just the YouTube, whatever. Um, yeah, so I like the initial request for a new stream failed, but it actually did set up a stream. So I actually just had to go back and do it. Anyways, so I just love this process we're having, like just digging deep down and discussing and getting completely stuck in what seems to be like irrelevant details. But they getting stuck in those details means that there's something about the mental model. Because a mental model is gonna help us unstuck us and stick us. um, and but by having this process of just diving deep in during the day and then getting a good night's sleep, because that is what sleep does, right? It just, when you get stuck, you're digging down into something, having a night's sleep untangles everything and kind of brings you out of the hole you were digging during the day. I never had that explicit mental image of it before, but it's exactly how I feel about it. And when you think about it that way, you kind of just lean into it, right? Because it can be very, very frustrating feeling that you get stuck. But just think of it as identifying an actual problem, but it being like identifying that problem and then kind of getting yourself out of the hole is very difficult. But that's exactly what sleep does. Anyway, so one thing I realized uh, in terms of the mental model, which hasn't been that obvious to me, is that when you're in this world of React, what you're doing is, we're gonna remove this because this is a little bit flaky. It's that you open your app on a route, right? And in this mental model, what you do is that you create exactly what you need for that specific route. You even have server-side components, right? So, how should I put this? Okay, I'm gonna explain it first. So you kind of narrow down exactly what you need to present the exact information, the resource that the user is asking for, right? But that's not the case on the other side. On the other side, you have all your state, right? You build up this like, and you might not even have like nested URLs. Maybe everything is just one page, right? Um, but at the end of the day, like everything is just this big state tree. Um, but what's different is that you kind of activate nodes. Um, so, how should I put this? Okay, let's draw. So in this world, you have you ask for something very specific, right? So you get in here as a user. Maybe this is like some URL, right? You get in here, it creates something. This might even be server side. And then it goes in and it kind of creates the state and fetches the data needed exactly for that specific resource. That's how this world works. This is how React is designed to work. Especially considering server-side components and so on. But when you have this other model, what you do instead is that you don't even have the URL. You just have this like big ass state tree. Branch A, branch B. Like you initialize all of it. It doesn't matter which page you hit, right? And what rather happens is that you still go through like a URL. But when you hit this component based on this URL, what you do is that you activate a branch in this state tree. So it's almost like you're focusing on a branch of your application. And you kind of light it up. And that means maybe it will do some data fetching, some subscriptions or whatever, but you're also free to start populating everything else, right? So you're in complete control of how are we gonna like build up the state of the application, and the expectation is that you're certain to move into these other branches of your state. But that's not a guarantee here. Like the user experience here is that you might hit a single URL, you highly efficiently produce the state and data and UI for that specific resource, right? But at the cost of when you're going to navigate other places, you don't have that immediately accessible to you. And it's very URL driven. That's another thing, right? The interactions are moving between pages, moving between URLs. While in this world, you might even just have one page, and the interactions are just lighting up different parts of your state tree or your state. But still, you might like jump to a different URL, but that doesn't mean it throws away your other state, right? You want to keep your state alive because you expect the user to navigate a lot within each page and between pages, if you even have pages. Yes. And I want to kind of express that in a better way. That was just like my initial brain dump. But what I realized even more is that a thing I've done wrong with this mental model is that I've tried to, even a simple thing as current page, right? For some reason, I've been thinking that if you imagine this being like page A, page B, like it's not even a page, it's like dashboard or settings, right? And then you hit the dashboard. And in my mind, I've been thinking, oh, now we have to set the current page, right? But you don't have to do that. The dashboard, like the React router is mounting the dashboard component, and the dashboard component just looks at the dashboard, right? But if you want to do side effects, like maybe you don't want to go and fetch all the data for the dashboard immediately, regardless of where you are in the app. Maybe you only want to do that when you're on the actual dashboard, right? Or you have a subscription that should only run when you're on the actual dashboard. But instead of making your state management aware of what the UI, the state of the UI, right? What you do is you just subscribe. So when this component, the dashboard component, mounts, what you do is that you just say state.dashboard.subscribe. That's all you do. And that will trigger the side effects of being on the dashboard. And when you navigate away from the dashboard, it's going to unsubscribe to that, right? And then you might navigate to, let's see. Then you might navigate to a different page, which is like settings or something, right? And now it just points to settings and it starts subscribing to it at that top level component. And that might trigger some data fetching or whatever. So the point is that one of the biggest problems with external state management is like, what do we do about routing? But you do nothing about routing. Your external state management, like routing is a UI thing. It just helps you display something specific, right? It just maps to a component. But again, your external state management shouldn't care about that. Your external state management is just this branches of state that you light up when using a subscription. Yeah, that was my sleep revelation. And it makes so much sense to me. because this has been like the really sticky moment of like, yeah, but do I then do state first routing? Do I use the React router, but then when I do a route, do I then call my external state management and tell it which page I'm on? Stuff like that. No, you don't do that. You just use the state related to whatever you want to display. And then if you need to run certain effects related to certain state you're consuming, just add a subscribe method to it. And then it will stop doing that side effect when you navigate away from it. And it gives full flexibility, right? If the UI suddenly has the settings inside the dashboard, right? You subscribe to both of them. So, yeah. This is a big moment for me. It makes so much sense to me. But explaining it is a little bit more tricky. So there's something about this, like, let's try to make some pointers. Are these different? Okay. Navigate, interaction by URL. There's like more to this, but I'm gonna just put some notes here, and then we're gonna try to, maybe we need another night's sleep on this, but interaction by URL, like primarily, and then I want to say state data by URL. Interaction, like it's interaction by moving between pages, right? But okay, let's just write that. Between URLs. But this is very different. This is interaction by what's the opposite of interaction by URLs? Well, I want to say not interaction, but state changes by URL. So you're like, how should I put this? So whenever you change the state, well, it's not completely true. Like you have a shopping cart, maybe, or, but it's what's the primary driver of state changes? It's the URL. Because you're navigating between pages. But here you have like an overwhelming complexity of state changes within. Yeah, I won't say state changes by interaction. I'm just going to write this now. It's not perfect. We'll get to it. And then state data by URL. Maybe we should remove this. State changes by URL. State changes by interaction. Yeah, I'm gonna say state data changes by URL, state data changes by interaction. Yeah, okay, we're gonna leave it at that because I want to discuss another thing as well. Cool. Okay, that's great. This is like a huge relief for me. Like I'm thinking about like the different apps I've been building and how I've immediately when I start like designing the dashboard settings state, it's like even calling it pages. And then, oh, but then I need a current page. And then how do I change the current page? Do I use a state first router? Do I use React router? I need to, by each page change, I need to decide what I want to do for that page change. I remember in Code Sandbox, we had like open dashboard, open sandbox. There was a bunch of stuff happening doing that. And I believe on the React router we were using there, it was like an action thing. When it hit the route, we would then, we would actually use an effect. Yeah, so it's kind of the same thing, right? Yeah, I remember at Code Sandbox, we would have a use effect that would call open dashboard when the dashboard component mounted. And it would kind of put it into the, like the dashboard will be the current page and so on and so on. And that's like fine, but that means that like it doesn't matter. Like what we could have done is we could have fired a subscription instead. We could just say dashboard.subscribe on the use effect, and then we would run everything we needed to run. Yeah, and just that mental model gives so much more flexibility because you're not bound to a specific UI state, right? You just light up the dashboard branch, and there are certain things you want to happen, and the subscription does that because it literally lights up a branch and then dims it down again because that the actual UI isn't interested in that branch anymore. And it's driven by the life cycle of the components. Okay. Oh, sorry. I have such just a freaking cold. Okay, but there's another thing I want to discuss as well, and that is, did I push? Oops. Just 2 seconds. Yeah. Am I good? No boogers? So there's another thing. I started writing some documentation for it. So there is, like we discussed with these infamous devices, is that this subscription pattern I talked about, this can also be used for dynamic state, right? So in this case, we always have a dashboard and settings and some default state, and maybe we'll even fire up some data fetching and whatever. Doesn't matter what you're looking at. We're just prepping the state lazily because it's like the user experience is that it's very likely that you're going to access that state. But then you might have other things like these freaking devices. So it's very unlikely that you're going to look at all the devices, right? So what we want to do is lazily fetch the data of a single device if you happen to click it. And the question is like, how do we do that? So the challenge here is that we need to run a promise, right? So what we could do is that we can manually handle it in the sense that whenever you like, maybe it's even a collapsible thing, right? You're looking at some hardware thing, and then you can open some device information. And only when you like expand the device information, that's when we go and fetch that data. And you can have like a specific state for this. So each device has like a pending, fulfilled, rejected state, right? Kind of reflecting a promise. And maybe that's how you have to do it. But there is this other thing, which is that React is able to consume promises. And with Impact React, I actually built Impact React. So with Impact API, Signals API. So with the Signals API, you're actually able to consume promises in React. So here you can see async value. Yeah, sorry, with the use hook. So you could consume promises using the use hook. And the way it was implemented here was based on a RFC, where React would actually populate promises with a status. So it could synchronously access that promise. But they didn't do it, I learned yesterday. So what they've done instead, and this is still up in the air, it seems like, because they have something called start transition. So what you can do instead is like when you want to set, so the problem with this is like, okay, when you open the device, what you can do is you can consume it as a promise. So you literally consume the data fetching promise as the value of like the state of the device. And that's fine. The problem is if you want to update that value, now you have to replace the whole promise. But if you replace the promise, even if it's a promise resolved, it's gonna jank the UI. It's gonna throw to the suspense boundary and then show the device again, which sucks. But as I understand it, the way React intends to do this is to combine it with start transition. So when you want to set the promise again as a resolved promise, you do it in a start transition callback. And that's going to tell React that, oh, this promise, well, it's we're going to wait for it to update or resolve itself before we actually trigger the UI, the reconciliation. But this doesn't work with like MobX, for example. And I suppose it's because we're not actually consuming the promise. We're kind of implicitly consuming it, right? So I think it's bound very much to the set state. So that doesn't work. So the question then becomes, but at the same time, it's like, it makes a lot of sense to consume the promise initially. But when you update the value, like you don't want to keep consuming it as a promise necessarily. So you kind of only want that on the initial run. So the question is like, what do you do? So one way of doing it is, so let's say, oh, maybe we can just use this one. So here, for example, I have a list of to-dos, but I'm just making a promise of to-dos. I'm just fetching it. And in the component now, I can safely do this. Use state.todos. That works super fine. But I can't, but what if I want to subscribe? Again, here I'm subscribing to the to-dos, and now I just want to update it. But now I can't use the use hook. It's an invalid property or invalid argument, because now it's just an array and you can't use that with the use hook, which is kind of sad. I hope the use hook would work exactly like await, because if you consume state to-dos in your state management, you can just use await regardless of it being an actual promise or you set the actual value. So basically you could type this as promise of to do or to do, right? You could type it as this, and if you have like a function somewhere, add to do, you could say to do's equals await state to do's, right? And it doesn't matter if it's the actual promise or if it's to do or if it's an actual array, you'll get the array here. So that's actually pretty nice that you can start out asynchronously and then you move into synchronous world. But you can't do that in React. So what you would have to do here is like state to do's instance of promise. You do this, or you say state to do's. So this would also work, right? And maybe it's fine. Maybe it's fine. That's the thing. I don't know. And you could even have like use promise or use maybe promise like state to do's. And that would just be under the hood. Yeah, like this is the thing that I'm closest to thinking is the best idea, because what you can do now is, if we look further down here, we kind of have this thing where you have to do's, and then, oh yeah, this is wrong. The thing is that it's just promise, right? You don't have any additional primitive or abstraction. Yeah, I could use promise resolve there. But the problem there is that, okay, so to get back to that, so if to kind of make the point, so if I were to do promise.resolve here, which means that I wouldn't have to do this typing, right? It would just do this, right? But if I do this, then this UI is going to blink. That's the problem. And as I mentioned, React had suggestions on how to handle this, but they went away from it. So there, as far as I know, currently there is no way to update a promise. Like technically you can do this, but this resolve promise will throw to the suspense boundary, causing a jank in the UI, like showing loading. So it just won't work. So I think, and even if they change this, there's something about being able to do this, like handle things synchronously when you update it. Because you might want to like iterate these to-dos, or like you want to do something with the to-dos. Did that make sense? So then we have, here again, we have just the to-dos, but now we also have to-dos details. So this is like the device thing I explained. Like you have the to-dos, and then when you expand something on the to-do, then you want to go and fetch some data and display it. So let's fix this example. So here I have a method, and I'm calling it read because it's just a convention that was introduced from React. It's not really a convention because I kind of moved away from all of this, but it kind of indicates that it's meant to indicate that you're reading a promise. So when this function is called, like you have the ID of the to-do, right? And then it checks, do I already have the to-do details? And let's remove this thing. And if I don't have the to-do details, go and grab it and then return the promise. Yes, exactly. So diving into the current state of suspense and the use and everything, it like literally said you should consider not using this for client apps. It's really server client kind of primitive. But at the same time, React doesn't build React for this use case of rich client applications. It's like very much like the server client based approach. And I see like being able to consume, like suspense is pretty awesome. So to kind of build on this example, you can see here. So you can imagine like you actually navigated, maybe on a route. You routed to a to-do and you have like details equals true in the query, right? And what you could do, you could just go down and you could use read to-do details. And it would immediately fetch the thing instead of you in your state management. Like you have to first figure out, oh, I need to access my router inside my state management to know if it's like expanded or not. And if it is, then go and fetch the to do and update the state. And like, there's so much stuff around that. While here, we're just saying, even here, like maybe you have const router, it's like use router, and then, oh, sorry. So what you would do is like router.query details, details, something like that, ID, whatever. Function details. Yeah, I'm passing. Let's see. Let's just pass it down here just for fun. Yeah, so in this case, you could safely just render out the details and it'll go and you'll probably have some suspense around this, right? And the only thing your state management needs to care about is exposing a function that actually runs the promise and keeps a reference to it. But even here, again, like what if you want to subscribe to these details as part of this? So for example, use effect, let's call it details. So use effect, you would do something like details.subscribe, something like this. And that subscription is going to update the details, right? But now the details are a promise. So now you kind of have to manage that. Yeah, like it would be nice to have it synchronous instead of doing promise. Again, like you can't do promise.resolve with the new details of the to-do, because then it's gonna fire the suspense boundary again. So that doesn't work, and it's annoying. But you can also not use suspense, right? You could just make these to-do details. They could just be state, or maybe you could just call it what do you call it? Async to-do detail, right? And when you do that, you have you give it the ID, whatever, and then it returns like an object that has like status is pending, status is fulfilled, status is rejected, and then you just read that. So you say, and then you can say, where should we put it? Yeah, so you wouldn't have it here, you would rather put it here. Const details equals, well, you only want it when you actually open the details, sorry. So you wouldn't have suspense here. You would rather put, sorry. So you read the details here and you would check like status, pending, return, loading, or something. Oh, loading. Oh my God, loading. Something like that. So you would rather just use a state machine for this. And at the end of the day, that's probably the best thing. Because the use hook is really designed for server-side interaction. Sorry, I just had to get that out. You can use suspense query as promise caching engine, then you can... Yeah, that's true. So you would like... Yeah, so you would kind of use query to cache the promise. So you could still have like read to do details. Sorry, let's go all the way back. Yeah, because that's a thing I was wondering. Because I also read, or ChatGPT told me, like use query or React query uses these mechanisms under the hood, but those are client libraries. So it's definitely okay to play around with this. But sorry, so instead of doing this, you would rather like use suspense query or something, and you would do it like this. Yeah, so you would combine it with React query, and it would cache the promise. That's a cool idea, if I understood you correctly. Yeah, I guess it would be something like this or something. Yeah, that would also be possible. But yeah, so that there's these 3 ways of doing it, and I'm not sure. What's interesting about just doing, like, just have a state for it, is that yeah, but that's also a little bit tricky, because if you want to do async to do title, let's say we actually implemented that. Yeah, or I guess we could do this. Sorry. So you would say fetch to do details, something like that. And then you have ID, and then you can even do like no, you can't do async. So you would kind of return this like generic of async whatever. So you will have some kind of async thing, which would be like status pending. And then you would like actually fetch to do, then value, and then you would, but then you would have to go to do details ID equals status fulfill. Like you could of course have some kind of abstraction around this, but just to show how you kind of would have to do this, status error, and then you have the error. So this is kind of how you would do it if you did like just use your own object kind of thing. And now it doesn't matter, right? If you want to update this, you can just check the status. Is it fulfilled? Okay, update the value. And that would also update the component normally. So I wonder what use suspense query. I want to look at that. Use suspense query. Like, how does that actually handle updating? Oh my god. Yeah, and I guess, yeah, sorry. So use suspense query. So you would kind of revalidate it. Like if you wanted to update the promise. Yeah, I wonder how that would work. Yeah. So I'm kind of in favor of like just doing this as a pattern, right? That's kind of the thing we're trying to do here is like just use the language and then just doing a little state machine around that thing that you want to asynchronously consume, or you want to like you want to consume it during render. That's the point. And And to do that, you need to have a consumer state machine so that you can synchronously read the state of the data and then act accordingly. Okay, cool. I think that's going to be my conclusion for that. At least for now. We'll always revisit things. But yeah, so I think I'm gonna iterate a bit on where were we? I'm gonna iterate a bit on this to make this like crystal clear what I mean about this. And then we're gonna jump back into the application. And we're gonna... What's interesting about Family Scrum is that it doesn't really have like pages in that sense. Like, or when I talk about like lighting up the state branches, they're all lit up all the time. Oh, it returns a promise as well. I wonder how they handle updating the promise then. Like if the query revalidates, how do they ensure? That's interesting. How do they ensure that you don't get that jank? Because the RFC I based my implementation on was that like React will actually add a status to the promise itself. And if it already has a status that's fulfilled, it won't throw to the suspense boundary at all. But I read that they decided not to do that. So I don't understand how, because the use thing will actually get the promise. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, I'm curious about that. I am curious. Yeah, so the Family Scrum app, like all the state is lit up all the time. Because it's, in that sense, it's a simple app. Because like even on just the first page, right, you need well, of course we could explore, like I'm adding a router there now. So if you were to go to like a specific page, yeah, well, yeah, just to kind of explore the pattern, it's like, okay, if you hit the groceries page, for example, it won't be subscribing to to-dos or dinners or weeks. It will only do that if you actually move back to the dashboard. Yeah, we could explore that. Yeah, cool. But I'm gonna try to get our next JS 14 app to 15 today, because we're gonna explore the React compiler a bit, because that's enabled experimentally in Next.js 15, just to see if it it can help us with some performance issues. And we'll see how far I get with that. If that's like boopity boop, then maybe I'll do another stream later. Regardless, we're gonna spend that stream actually coding again. That's nice. Okay, thanks for following along. Thanks so much for the input here, especially the use suspense query. It's a very interesting thing. It's a very cool pattern to be able to consume promises in components. But it's, yeah, like we talked about, what if you want to update the data within that promise? Do you allow that state value to be a promise or not a promise, affecting typing? Or do you always treat it as a promise? But what does that mean for suspense? Will it create jank in the UI? And does it feel right to like keep updating a value as a promise? What is kind of cool though, another argument for doing the state-based one that I explained here, is that you can actually access this in derived state. So if you're deriving some state that depends on asynchronous state, you can actually derive on the status. So even though the value you're trying to derive, like using Computed, is asynchronous, you can still derive it. But if it's just a promise, you can't derive it. Because it's a promise, you can't await in the Computed. But you can check this pending status, and then when it changes, the status changes and it will recompute the thing. New promise can be created for new task. What specifically? I lost the context there. Sorry. You mean like you can create a new promise for updating data? If that's the case, the thing I don't understand is that use suspense query caches the original promise, and then updating the data will be a new promise. And even though use suspense query waits for that promise to resolve because it already has a stale promise, it will need to put that resolved promise as a replacement for the other promise. But React isn't able to read synchronously a resolved promise. It will throw it to the suspense boundary and cause a jank regardless. So yeah, exactly. That's what you meant. Yeah, so as I said, like suspense query has the stale promise and can technically wait for the new promise to resolve before it replaces the old promise. Like that's how it does data, right? Stale. That's what SWR is, stale while revalidate. But at the end of the day, it needs to output a promise to the use hook, this new promise. And even though it's resolved, that's gonna be thrown to the suspense boundary and cause the fallback to flicker quickly. At least that's how I understand it. Where the RFC would actually allow suspense query to add a status to that new promise that it's actually resolved and actually attach the resolved value to the promise. So when you used it with the use hook, it wouldn't throw to the suspense boundary. It would just give you the value synchronously. But yeah, maybe suspense query is using this start transition thing. That's how they solve it. I guess they have to. Like, I don't understand having this API if you can't do that. So maybe that's how they solve it. Like they use start transition or something that avoids it to throw to the new promise to the suspense boundary. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so use suspense query probably does that internally. Yeah, it's interesting. But in terms of external state management, like you might have a subscription that that's updating that data, but now you're using suspense query to, yeah, I guess you could, yeah, I guess it would still, yeah. The thing I don't quite understand how it would work is then if you were using use suspense query, like use suspense query doesn't just take the promise, it takes a callback to get the promise. Or can you actually just give it the promise? Because then if your external state store replaces the promise, like the suspense query doesn't know that it should like rerun again. How would you tell it to? Yeah, you will kind of have to like use an effect or something to run the query function again. Or does it have? But yeah, I kind of want to say that regardless of like that, this would definitely be like technically valid. And it's great for like when you actually use React Query with React, and that's how you do all your data caching and stuff. But if you have your data in an external state store, I would suggest you get more benefits from not using the promise itself, but just have your own state for the asynchronous value so that you can even derive that asynchronous value. Oh yeah, because you can do, there is not only strings in the key, right? You can actually have like an object there, so you can even have the promise itself there. Like if the promise was part of the key, you could like but then wouldn't it break the cache? Yeah, you would have to have some kind of state. No, you would have like, in this case, to-dos, the ID of the to-do, and then you would kind of have you could have the promise itself as the last part of the key, because it kind of, I don't know. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting thing. But okay, I need to jump off and try to migrate, and then I maybe be back later today. We'll see. Thanks a bunch for the discussion, and I wish you a nice and happy day. Bye for now.